Emily Hartfield was 23 years old, a third-year university student majoring in psychology, when she received the call that would change her life. She had always been an introspective and intelligent young woman, with a quiet demeanor that masked the turbulent emotions beneath. Raised in a small suburban town, Emily had moved away to attend university in the city, seeking distance from the complexities of her family life. She was slender and of average height, with dark, curly hair that framed her delicate features. Emily had always been seen as the responsible and reserved one in the family, the type to avoid confrontation and keep her feelings bottled up inside. Emily's parents had divorced when she was just 10 years old, a bitter separation that left deep emotional scars. Her mother, Sarah, had struggled to raise Emily on her own for several years before she met Richard. Richard was everything Sarah had hoped for in a partner: charming, financially stable, and seemingly devoted to her and Emily. He was a successful businessman in his early 40s when they married, and his arrival in Emily's life brought with it a sense of stability that had been missing since her parents' divorce. Sarah Hartfield, now in her late 40s, was a warm and loving woman who had always put her family first. She had been a school teacher for most of her life, a career that allowed her to be home in the afternoons and summers to care for her daughter. Sarah had always been the kind of mother who tried to maintain a close relationship with Emily, but the emotional distance between them had grown over the years. Sarah's marriage to Richard seemed to be a new beginning for her, and she had embraced it wholeheartedly, believing that she had finally found happiness after the hardships of her first marriage. Richard Lawson, now in his early 50s, was a tall, handsome man with a commanding presence. He had made his fortune in the real estate business, owning several properties across the state. Richard was the kind of man who exuded confidence and charm, easily winning over those around him. When he married Sarah, he seemed to be the perfect addition to the Hartfield family, a stabilizing force who brought financial security and a sense of calm. However, beneath his polished exterior, Richard harbored darker tendencies. He was manipulative and controlling, traits that only became apparent to those closest to him. Emily had a complicated relationship with Richard from the start. At first, she was wary of him, sensing that there was something beneath his charming facade that didn't quite add up. However, as time went on, Richard began to take an interest in Emily in ways that made her uncomfortable. He was always attentive, always praising her for her intelligence and beauty, and he made her feel special in a way she hadn't felt since her father left. Emily, starved for male attention and approval, found herself drawn to Richard despite her better judgment. The turning point came when Emily was 18, during the summer before she left for university. Sarah had gone away on a week-long trip with friends, leaving Emily and Richard alone in the house. It was during this time that the nature of their relationship changed. Richard, always careful and calculated, began to blur the lines between stepfather and something more. He would spend long hours talking with Emily, discussing her future, her dreams, and her fears. Emily, flattered by the attention, let her guard down. She began to see Richard not just as her stepfather, but as someone who truly understood her. One evening, after a particularly intense conversation about her parents' divorce, Richard comforted Emily in a way that crossed a line. What began as a comforting hug turned into a kiss, and before Emily fully realized what was happening, they had entered into a forbidden relationship. The affair was brief, lasting only a few weeks before Emily left for university, but it left a lasting impact on her. The guilt and shame she felt were overwhelming, but she couldn't deny the intense feeling she had for Richard. Conflicted and confused, Emily decided to put as much distance between herself and her family as possible, throwing herself into her studies and cutting off nearly all contact with Richard and her mother. Lily Lawson, Emily's stepsister, was 5 years younger and had always been the more outgoing and vibrant of the two. At 18, Lily had just graduated from high school and was preparing to start university in the fall. She was the golden child, popular, confident, and full of life. Where Emily was quiet and introspective, Lily was extroverted and carefree, often the center of attention in any room. She was beautiful, with long blonde hair, striking blue eyes, and a contagious smile. Lily had been the light of the family, her presence always bringing joy to those around her. Despite their differences, Emily and Lily had shared a close bond growing up. They weren't biological sisters, but they had grown to love each other deeply. Lily had looked up to Emily, admiring her intelligence and maturity, and Emily had felt protective of her younger sister. However, the relationship had grown strained in recent years, largely due to Emily's self-imposed distance from the family. Lily didn't understand why Emily had pulled away, and Emily couldn't bring herself to explain. The guilt she carried over her affair with Richard made it impossible for her to be around Lily without feeling like a fraud. Now, standing in the hallway of her childhood home, Emily was overwhelmed with a flood of emotions. The news of Lily's death had been a devastating blow, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed her sister. The circumstances surrounding Lily's death were still unclear, but the official story was that she had lost control of her car on a rainy night, crashing into a tree on a deserted road. The police had ruled it an accident, but Emily couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story. The guilt she felt over her estrangement from Lily only compounded her grief, and she was determined to find out what had really happened. When Emily arrived at the family home for the funeral, the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah was a wreck, barely holding herself together as she made preparations for the service. Richard, on the other hand, was strangely composed, his demeanor cold and distant. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease around him, a feeling that had been growing since she first learned of Lily's death. There was something about the way he avoided talking about Lily, the way he seemed almost detached from the tragedy, that made Emily's skin crawl. As Emily settled back into her old room, she was struck by how little had changed. The same furniture, the same decor, even the same smell of lavender and vanilla that her mother had always loved. It was as if time had stood still in this house, as if the years she had spent away had never happened. But for all the familiarity, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. The first night back home, Emily lay awake in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of the past. She couldn't stop thinking about Richard, about the affair that had driven her away from her family. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, and she found herself questioning every decision she had made since that summer. Had she made the right choice in leaving? Could she have done something to prevent what had happened to Lily? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no easy answers. The next morning, Emily was up early, unable to sleep. She wandered through the house, feeling like a stranger in her own home. As she passed by Lily's room, she hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The room was exactly as she remembered it, bright, cheerful, and filled with Lily's personality. There were posters on the walls, photos of friends and family, and a pile of school books on the desk. But there was also an emptiness, a sense of loss that permeated the space. Emily felt a pang of guilt as she stepped inside. She had been so distant, so caught up in her own life, that she had barely spoken to Lily in the past year. The last time they had talked, it had been a brief, awkward conversation over the phone. Lily had been excited about starting university, but Emily had been distracted, barely listening as her sister chattered on about her plans. Now, standing in Lily's room, Emily wished she had paid more attention, that she had made more of an effort to stay connected. As she looked around the room, Emily noticed a small notebook lying on the bed. It was a simple spiral-bound journal, the kind that Lily had always used to jot down her thoughts and ideas. Emily picked it up, feeling a strange sense of unease. She knew she shouldn't invade her sister's privacy, but something compelled her to open the journal and read. She flipped through the pages, scanning the entries, until something caught her eye. The journal was filled with typical teenage musings, thoughts about school, friends, and future plans, but there was one entry that stood out. It was dated just a few weeks before Lily's death, and the tone was different from the rest. The handwriting was more frantic, the words more urgent, as if Lily had been in a state of emotional turmoil when she wrote it. The entry described feelings of guilt and confusion, of being caught up in something that she didn't know how to handle. Emily's heart raced as she read the words. It was clear that Lily had been involved in something serious, something that had been weighing heavily on her mind. The entry didn't mention any names, but it was clear that Lily had been in some kind of relationship, one that she knew was wrong. Emily's mind immediately went to Richard. Could it be possible? Could Lily have been involved with him the way she had been? Emily couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within her since discovering Lily's journal. The possibility that her stepsister had been involved with Richard, just as she had been, gnawed at her relentlessly. Her mind whirled with questions and suspicions, each one more troubling than the last. What had really happened in the months leading up to Lily's death? Had Richard manipulated Lily the same way he had manipulated her? And if so, had this secret relationship played a role in her tragic accident? The more Emily thought about it, the more convinced she became that something sinister had transpired. The house that had once felt like home now seemed suffocating, filled with secrets that threatened to consume her. She couldn't ignore the strange behaviors she had observed in Richard since returning his cold demeanor, the way he avoided talking about Lily, and the unease that seemed to hang in the air whenever he was around. There was a tension between them that neither could ignore, and Emily was determined to get to the bottom of it. The day after discovering Lily's journal, Emily decided to delve deeper into her sister's life. She needed to understand what Lily had been going through and how Richard fit into it all. She began by going through Lily's room more thoroughly, searching for anything that might provide more context. Emily carefully examined every item, every piece of clothing, every book, hoping to find some clue that would reveal the truth. As she rummaged through Lily's drawers, Emily found a box tucked away at the back of the closet. It was small and unassuming, but something about it caught her attention. She carefully pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside, she found a collection of items that seemed oddly out of place: movie ticket stubs, receipts from restaurants, a pair of earrings that Emily didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper with a few hastily scrawled words. Emily unfolded the paper and felt her heart drop as she read the note. "I can't keep this up. It's too much. I'm scared." The handwriting was unmistakably Lily's. The note was brief, but the fear and desperation in the words were palpable. It was clear that Lily had been deeply troubled, and Emily was certain that this note was connected to whatever relationship Lily had been involved in. But the note didn't name anyone or provide any specifics, leaving Emily frustrated and desperate for more answers. Determined to dig deeper, Emily decided to talk to some of Lily's friends. She needed to know if anyone else had been aware of what was going on in Lily's life. She started with Lily's best friend, Sophie, who had always been close to their family. Sophie had been a constant presence during Emily's childhood, and she and Lily had been inseparable through high school. If anyone knew what Lily had been going through, it would be Sophie. Emily called Sophie and asked if they could meet. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in town, a place they had all frequented together when they were younger. As Emily waited for Sophie to arrive, she felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation, but she knew it was necessary. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When Sophie arrived, she looked as distraught as Emily felt. The two hugged tightly, sharing a moment of grief for the friend and sister they had lost. After ordering coffee, they sat down in a corner booth, away from the other patrons. There was a heaviness between them, the weight of unspoken words that both seemed hesitant to voice. Emily decided to start gently. "Sophie, I know this is really hard, but I need to ask you some things about Lily. I've been going through her things, and I found some things that are troubling. I feel like there's something I'm missing, something that she didn't tell me." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she took a shaky breath before responding. "Emily, there are things that Lily confided in me, but I didn't realize how serious it was. I thought she was just going through a rough patch, that it was something she could handle on her own." Emily leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? What was she going through?" Sophie hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Lily was. She was involved with someone she wasn't supposed to be involved with. She told me about it a few months ago, and she was really upset. She said she was in love, but she also knew it was wrong. She wouldn't tell me who it was, but she was scared. Emily. She was scared of what it would do to her family, to her mom. The confirmation hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from Sophie made it real. Lily had been involved with Richard. There was no doubt in Emily's mind now. Did she ever say anything specific? Anything that might help me understand what happened? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, she was really secretive about it. All she said was that she couldn't keep it a secret forever, and that she was terrified of what would happen when the truth came out. I tried to get her to tell me more, but she just shut down whenever I asked. Emily's mind raced as she processed Sophie's words. It was all starting to make sense: the note, Lily's fear, the tension between her and Richard. Lily had been involved in a relationship that she knew would destroy her family if it came to light. And now, Lily was gone, leaving behind only questions and a gnawing sense of guilt for those who loved her. Emily thanked Sophie for her honesty, feeling a deep sense of sadness as they parted ways. She knew that Sophie was grieving too, and that she had done her best to help Lily. But the truth was still elusive, and Emily wasn't sure where to turn next. As she walked back to her car, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: grief, anger, confusion, and fear. That evening, back at the family home, Emily found herself alone with Richard. Her mother had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's events, leaving Emily and Richard in the living room together. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension that had been building since Emily's return. Richard was sitting in his usual armchair, reading a book, but Emily could tell he wasn't really focused. His eyes were distant, his posture stiff. Emily sat on the couch, pretending to watch the television, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew she needed to confront Richard, but the idea terrified her. What if he denied everything? What if he confirmed her worst fears? Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Emily spoke. "Richard, I've been thinking a lot about Lily. There are things I've found, things that don't make sense to me. I need to understand what really happened." Richard didn't look up from his book. "Lily's death was a tragedy, Emily. But digging into the past isn't going to bring her back. We need to focus on moving forward." Emily's frustration boiled over. "I can't just move forward, Richard. I found her journal. I've talked to her friends. She was involved in something that was tearing her apart. I need to know what it was. Did you know about it? Were you involved?" Richard finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Emily, I don't know what you think you found, but you need to let this go. Lily was a troubled girl. She had a lot on her mind, but it's not fair to dig up dirt on her now that she's gone." The coldness in his voice sent a chill down Emily's spine. She felt a surge of anger, the frustration of being stonewalled by the man who had once been so close to her. "Don't lie to me, Richard. I know there was something between you and Lily. I know she was in love with you, and I know she was scared. What did you do to her?" Richard's expression darkened, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flash of fear in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "Emily, you're letting your emotions get the best of you. Lily was a sweet girl, but she had a lot of issues. She made some bad decisions, but those were her choices. You can't blame me for what happened to her." The deflection only fueled Emily's anger. "I'm not blaming you for her choices. I'm blaming you for taking advantage of her. She was just a kid, Richard. You were supposed to protect her, not manipulate her into some sick relationship." Richard stood up, his demeanor turning icy. "You're out of line, Emily. You have no idea what you're talking about. I suggest you drop this before you make things worse." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, her mind reeling from the confrontation. She had hoped that Richard would at least show some remorse, some sign that he understood the gravity of what he had done. But instead, he was doubling down, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Emily knew she couldn't stay there any longer. She needed to get out, to clear her head and figure out what to do next. Without another word, she turned and left the room, grabbing her coat and heading for the front door. Emily sat at her desk, the dim light from her lamp casting long shadows across her room. The video recordings of Lily were still open on her computer screen, frozen on the last frame of her stepsister's tear-streaked face. Emily's mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of grief, guilt, and anger. She had spent the last few days in a state of numb disbelief, trying to process everything she had uncovered. The truth was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined, but she knew that she couldn't let it end there. Lily's voice, pleading and apologetic, echoed in her mind, driving Emily forward with a renewed sense of purpose. After taking a deep breath to steady herself, Emily reached for her phone. She had already made the decision to take the videos to the police, but the thought of actually doing so filled her with dread. Richard had been a part of her life for so long, and the idea of confronting him with this evidence made her stomach churn. But there was no other choice. Lily deserved justice, and Emily was determined to see that she got it. The following morning, Emily made her way to the local police station. The small, nondescript building felt both imposing and insignificant, but she knew that what she was about to do would change everything. Clutching a flash drive containing the video files, she stepped inside, her heart pounding with each step. She approached the front desk, where a bored-looking officer glanced up at her. "I need to report something," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's about my stepsister, Lily. I have evidence that might explain her death." The officer's expression shifted from boredom to concern as he led Emily to a private room where she could speak with a detective. The process of explaining what she had found was excruciating. As she recounted the details of Lily's relationship with Richard, Emily felt the weight of her own involvement pressing down on her. She had been deceived, just like Lily, but the guilt of not recognizing the signs sooner gnawed at her relentlessly. The detective, a middle-aged woman with a stern but compassionate demeanor, listened intently as Emily spoke. When Emily handed over the flash drive, the detective's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. She assured Emily that the evidence would be thoroughly examined and that an investigation would be opened immediately. Emily was asked to stay available for further questioning, but for now, her part was done. Leaving the station, Emily felt both relieved and terrified. The ball was now in the authorities' court, but the ramifications of her actions loomed large. She knew that once the investigation began, everything would unravel, and the truth about Richard would come crashing down on their family. Over the next few days, Emily tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Her mother, still grieving Lily's death, was oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Richard, on the other hand, seemed increasingly agitated. He was more withdrawn than usual, spending long hours locked in his study, avoiding Emily whenever possible. Emily could see the cracks beginning to show, but she knew it was only a matter of time before everything broke wide open. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room trying to distract herself with a book, she heard the doorbell ring. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what was about to happen. A few moments later, her mother answered the door, and Emily could hear the muffled voices of the police officers as they introduced themselves. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Emily remained frozen in her seat as her mother called for Richard, her voice tinged with confusion and concern. Richard emerged from his study, his face pale and drawn. When he saw the police at the door, his eyes widened in shock, and Emily could see the fear behind his stoic facade. The officers informed Richard that they were there to ask him some questions regarding Lily's death, and they needed him to come with them to the station. Emily's mother, stunned by the sudden turn of events, looked to Richard for answers. "What's going on, Richard? Why are the police here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard struggled to maintain his composure as he turned to face her. "It's just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice tight. "I'll go down to the station and clear it up. There's nothing to worry about." But Emily could see the truth in his eyes. He knew that the walls were closing in on him, and there was no way out. As the police led him away, Richard glanced at Emily, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. Emily held his gaze, refusing to look away, even as a wave of fear and guilt washed over her. She knew she had done the right thing, but the reality of what she had set in motion was terrifying. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. The news of Richard's arrest spread quickly through their small town, and soon, everyone was talking about the shocking allegations against him. The media latched onto the story, turning their family's tragedy into a public spectacle. Reporters camped out on their lawn, and the phone rang incessantly with calls from curious neighbors and distant relatives, all eager to know the truth. Emily's mother was in a state of disbelief. She couldn't comprehend that the man she had loved and trusted for so many years could be capable of such deceit and betrayal. She questioned Emily repeatedly, trying to understand how this could have happened under her roof, how she could have been so blind to the truth. But Emily had no answers that could satisfy her. All she could do was try to be there for her mother, even as her own world crumbled around her. As the investigation progressed, more details about Richard's relationship with Lily came to light. The videos Emily had found were damning, but they were only the beginning. The police uncovered a trove of evidence: text messages, emails, and phone records that painted a picture of a man who had systematically manipulated and abused a vulnerable young woman. Richard had used his position of trust and authority to control Lily, isolating her from her friends and family and exploiting her emotions for his own gain. The evidence was overwhelming, and it wasn't long before Richard was formally charged with multiple crimes, including statutory rape, coercion, and contributing to Lily's death. The news sent shockwaves through the community, and the once respected businessman and stepfather was now reviled as a monster. The trial date was set, and Emily knew that the hardest part was yet to come. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Emily tried to prepare herself for what was to come. She knew that she would be called to testify, to recount the painful details of what she had discovered, and to face Richard in court. The thought of seeing him again, of reliving the trauma of the past few months, filled her with dread. But she also knew that she had no choice. She owed it to Lily to see this through, no matter how difficult it would be. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. Emily sat beside her mother, who had aged noticeably in the weeks since Richard's arrest. The strain of the ordeal was evident in her drawn face and hollow eyes, but she held her head high, determined to see justice done for her daughter. When Richard was brought into the courtroom, Emily felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, sorrow, and a deep, aching sense of betrayal. He looked haggard and defeated, a far cry from the confident, charming man she had once known. But even now, as he stood before the judge, he maintained his innocence, claiming that he had done nothing wrong, that Lily had been the one to pursue him. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous detail, presenting the evidence that Emily had uncovered, along with the additional material gathered during the investigation. The videos, the text messages, and the emails painted a clear and damning picture of Richard's actions, leaving little room for doubt. Emily listened in silence as the prosecutors described how Richard had manipulated and coerced Lily, how he had used her love and trust against her, driving her to a point of desperation from which she could see no escape. When it was time for Emily to take the stand, she felt a surge of anxiety. Her hands trembled as she made her way to the witness stand, and her voice wavered as she began to speak. But as she recounted the events that had led her to discover the truth, she found strength in her resolve. She spoke clearly and honestly about what she had found, about the conversations she had with Lily's friends, and about the final, heartbreaking videos that had revealed the depth of Lily's suffering. As Emily testified, she couldn't help but glance at Richard, who sat expressionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. It was clear that he knew the weight of the evidence against him, but he refused to show any remorse. This only fueled Emily's determination to see him held accountable for what he had done. The defense tried to cast doubt on Emily's testimony, suggesting that Lily had been troubled and that her death was a tragic accident unrelated to Richard's actions. They argued that Lily had been emotionally unstable and that her relationship with Richard, while inappropriate, had not been coerced. But the evidence was too strong, and the jury could see through the defense's attempts to deflect blame. After several days of testimony and cross-examination, the trial finally came to a close. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Richard to a lengthy prison term, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind.